regarding telecom regulatory policy, and enough that sometimes it's hard to keep it all straight. We have a Washington insider here today who's going to straighten us all out on not just the policy, but how it impacts what you're doing in the telco TV realm. So please welcome Josh Seidemann, the Director of Policy for NTCA. Thanks, Josh.
Good afternoon. I'm Joshua Seidemann, Director of Policy for NTCA. This particular time slot is a little bit unusual for me. I usually end up speaking right before lunch, and I always feel that I'm that last thing standing between you and the buffet. Put up with it for a little bit of time. Once, a few weeks ago, I was scheduled to speak after lunch, and I thought that I had it made until I noticed that everybody was falling asleep because they had just eaten that big buffet lunch. So I thought that today would be great because there's a little bit of buffer between lunch, there's a little bit of buffer between the anniversary party, and I turn around during one of the sessions before, and at the back of the room they have Turbo Dog. So I can't win. What I'd like to talk about today is, what we're looking at, this edge of transition with the FCC's action on the National Broadband Plan. And the question is, the first question is, what is this edge that we're talking about? And why does this matter to the provision of video in rural areas? We were at the FCC a few weeks ago, and we had a member company, a telephone company that also provides broadband, as most of them do, and it mentioned that it has video offerings, and FCC staff interrupted the fellow mid-sentence and said, "Are you making money off the video, or are you doing the video now just to keep customers on the network?" And I thought it was a remarkable question that revealed a lot of assumptions and, quite frankly, a lot of understandings. So we're going to talk about the edge. If we're talking to a bunch of folks from the wireless industry, maybe this is what comes to mind. And I see now this has singular wireless at the bottom of the logo, and again, how the world changes. Maybe the crowd's a little bit more up to date. Maybe when I say edge, we think of the edge. Maybe we start to think a little bit differently. Maybe we've got some lawyers in the room, and they're thinking about carve-outs and clauses, and they're thinking about regulatory change and what sort of an edge that might bring. And I think a lot of folks are looking at what is going on, and they're wondering whether this is a sort of edge for which people have to be prepared. I think that we are somewhere in between all of these sorts of positions. I think we've got a conversation about technology. I think we have a conversation about cultural and consumer preferences, and I think we have a conversation, quite frankly, about uncertainty, because we are very close to a major FCC decision that will affect the provision of broadband in rural America. And I'm just taking out the staple here. So let's take a look at what we're going to call the lay of the land for the next few minutes. First, we're going to get a very, very brief summary of the National Broadband Plan and what the FCC was doing with that and why that actually came to be. A closer look at rural America, why provision of service in rural America matters to the entire nation, and then a short revisit of what does this mean to be at the edge of transition. So the first thing to talk about is, why is there service in rural America? How did the Universal Service Fund come to be? How does that play into the National Broadband Plan? And at the outset, we have to take a little bit of a history lesson. Go back to the early part of the 20th century when AT&T, or the Ma Bell system, was building out networks throughout the United States, focusing on the big cities, not so much on the smaller towns. And it's perfectly understandable. In a telecommunications environment, it's capital intensive. The plant is very expensive. If you have customers that are either very spread out, you have to serve more customers per route mile, and that increases your per customer cost. By the same token, they might be clustered in a small town, but there's going to be very few folks to support a network that had to be paid and brought from a large city over great distances. Well, a number of small companies began to spring up, but it was not the rosy solution that many people thought it could be, because there were difficulties getting AT&T to interconnect with the small independent networks. Came about the Kingsbury Commitment, Federal government stepped in, and under the threat of an antitrust suit, AT&T, and this again goes back to the early part of the 20th century, agreed to stop muscling the small independent companies, and in exchange, the government would permit it to operate in its areas as a regulated monopoly. And these small telephone companies survived over the years, mostly through systems of internal payments between the telephone companies that were reflected in long-distance rates. Comes 1996, Congress rewrites the Communications Act of 1934 and says, you know something, from now on we're going to have a universal service fund. It is going to be explicit. Not only will it support explicitly these small telephone companies or even large telephone companies serving high-cost areas, but we're going to expand the mission of the Universal Service Fund. Now it's going to support schools and libraries. Now it's going to support low-income consumers. It's going to support rural health care, and kind of astoundingly, we're going to support competition. So the federal government, Congress ordered, we've got markets where we've got to use some sort of an external support mechanism to keep one company in business. We're going to use an external support mechanism to keep two companies in business. So the fund grows. At the same time, the base from which contributions to the fund are taken, and that base are long-distance or interstate telephone revenues, that's beginning to shrink down over time. So you've got expanding needs, a shrinking contribution base, and now mounting political pressure. All the while, the element or the part of the fund that is being used to support the small telephone companies, that level of funding is remaining pretty steady, mostly stable, declines in some years. In 2006, we're a dozen years past the 96 Act, and the FCC releases a notice of proposed rulemaking. And what that does is it seeks to amend the whole system of universal service. And what they want to do is they say, well, we've got to find a way to get some efficiencies in here. And then FCC Chairman Kevin Martin puts down a proposal on the table. The small companies buy into it. The large companies buy into it. The mid-sized telephone companies don't, because the proposal leaves them off in the cold. And a year and a half after these proposals are introduced, it reaches a fever pitch in the autumn of 2008, and it implodes and goes nowhere. So we're back to square one, and we've got the unintended consequences of unwanted growth. 2009, national economy is in the tank. So Congress thinks and says, well, what's the best way to start stimulating economic activity when the money's bad? Let's start spending money. And they come up with the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, known as the Stimulus Act. And part of the Stimulus Act dedicates several $1 billion for broadband deployment in rural areas through grants, through other programs, and you can quibble about the mechanisms by which those grants would have been extended, but it showed a serious commitment on the part of Congress, recognizing that broadband is a driver in the economy and brings the services that consumers are now demanding to what was called unserved and underserved areas. And as part of the Stimulus Act, Congress also directed the FCC to deliver what it called a National Broadband Plan. Now, the broadband plan that the FCC was supposed to deliver was not supposed to be a set of rules. It wasn't supposed to be a rulemaking proceeding. It reminds me of a pastor in Virginia who buys a lot of radio time in the D.C. metropolitan area, and he'll give about a 30-second or maybe a 60-second homily on the radio, and he'll close out each one by saying, it's not a sermon, it's just a thought. And that's what the broadband plan was supposed to be. Not a sermon, not rules, not a rulemaking proceeding, just a vision of what the FCC wanted to do, where they thought the country should go. It had some good things in it, but the vision that it had for small rural telephone companies was not encouraging. If you spun out the modeling put in by the FCC under that broadband plan, 50% of rural local exchange carriers would have gone cash negative by 2015. Another 40% would have gone cash negative by 2020. It had different proposals of how to get funding out to certain areas, how to change around the cost recovery mechanisms. It floated the idea that wireless could be a good substitute or a replacement for wired networks, but it opens up the question of how you get the backhaul going. Well, the rural community launched a response. and it said, this sort of a plan is going to simply devastate service in rural America, and this can't be the answer. Anybody out there want to talk about quantile regression analyses? Federal agency rulemaking? No takers. Anyway, so two guys are once hiking through the forest, and they stumble onto untouched native lands. They are captured immediately by the inhabitants, taken to the center of this village, tied to a tree, and the chief comes out. And the chief looks at them, and he says, "You have intruded on my sacred land, and you must pay the price. Will it be death or Chichi?" First guy scratches his chin, thinks to himself, "I know what death is, so I'm going to go for the Chichi." The chief goes, "Chichi it is." And out of the woods comes bounding this enormous gorilla. And it takes this guy and it rips him from the tree and hurls him into the woods. And for the next 20 minutes, you hear branches breaking, screams, rocks being thrown. Finally, the guy crawls out of the woods. He's cut. He's beaten. He is bloodied. He is bruised. He looks up at his friend. He takes a breath, gasps, and collapses. The chief looks at the second hiker. "And you, sir, what will it be, death or Chichi?" Second guy looks at his friend and says, "I know my will is filed at the county probate office. I paid my bills, and I know I shut the gas in the house off before I left. I'm going to take death." Chief looks at him and goes, "Wise choice. But first, a little Chichi." So the National Broadband Plan was not a rulemaking proceeding, but it was the basis for agency rulemaking, the FCC's agency rulemaking proceeding, which by law they have to set out proposed rules, and then the industry and the public gets to comment on it. Well, if we looked at the National Broadband Plan, we looked at the NPRM that the FCC issued, kind of death, kind of Chichi. One of them was near certain death quickly, and one of them was extended over a period of time. The FCC laid out some distinct proposals of how they would change cost recovery mechanisms for carriers that invest in rural America. And when the carriers took these back to their cost consultants and spun the numbers went red in several years. So in April 2011, just this past April actually, the three rural associations in Washington got together with another body, the National Exchange Carrier Association, and they put together a plan which met the FCC's goals. It worked within a certain budget, and it still was able to get broadband out and keep the providers of broadband in rural America going. At the same time, the FCC was telling the industry, all of the industry, don't come to us by yourselves. You people have to go back into a conference room somewhere, work together, and bring us some sort of a consensus framework that we can adopt. Because what we're going to do to you is going to be worse than anything you might put on the table for us. So the small carriers spoke to the big carriers spoke to the mid-sized carriers, the mid-sized carriers and the small carriers spoke to the big carriers, and they figured out that if we took the small carrier plan from April 2011 and you took the large and mid-sized carrier plan that they had been creating, and you tweaked a little bit here and you tweaked a little bit there, you could get them to come together, not as a blended plan, but as two complementary proposals that the FCC could take within the FCC's defined budget that would enable these companies to survive and to continue providing broadband networks in all regions of the nation. Why does this matter? Why are we so hooked into this public policy of bringing broadband or any sorts of communication services to rural America? And the answer to that is because rural America, the story of rural America, matters to all of America. So here's a 2010 U.S. Census Map. And if you look, the darker the green is on the map, the more densely populated those regions of the nation are. And as we mentioned before, and as you guys know, anytime you put in an infrastructure, anytime you put in plant, the more customers you can get to take service off of that plant, the more efficient your operation becomes because you lower the per customer cost of that service. So here's the census map, and here's a map of where rural telephone companies serve. And it's almost a reverse image. The smallest companies are serving the least densely populated areas of the United States. But we still haven't answered that question. What is the relationship between rural America to the rest of the nation? And that's where we begin to get into some social concepts, these social constructs. So if we take a look within that lens, within that viewpoint, we start off with what we called a frontier mentality, a frontier social contract. And this prevailed from the end of the American Revolution until roughly the end of the 19th century. And this was a contract that encouraged government-sponsored exploration and settlement of new lands. The Louisiana Purchase was a major watershed event in this sort of contract and view, where people were encouraged to move from the colonies further westward, explore, start seeing what the land has to offer. It wasn't just the government. There were private interests as well. California Gold Rush, extraordinary inducements. I'm not going to say anything about the 200 jackasses that they offered, but you had this social contract that you had great riches in these unsettled lands, and the federal government wanted people to move out there, see what was there, settle the land, and lay claims and stakes in a nation, and then bring those riches back home. Toward the end of the 19th century, we find ourselves at the Industrial Revolution. And suddenly workers are being consolidated in the urban areas. And now the rural areas are commodity producers. Now we have what we called the storehouse era. And during this era, the federal government adopted programs, whether it was the Rural Electrification Act or transportation programs that built roads, brought electricity, telephone systems throughout the United States. And all of these were layered upon the notion that the more people that are involved in any societal venture, the more valuable it becomes. And that's the notion underlying universal service policies, that the more people you have connected to the network, the more valuable that network becomes. When I can call and reach you, and you can call and reach the fellow sitting next to you or two rows over, the network becomes more valuable because more people are connected to it and more people are able to take advantage of it. During all of these years, the population is shifting across the United States as well, because as the government is encouraging movement and opening up new areas and providing the services to bring people to those areas, we see the population shift. And I don't know how easy it is to tell on this map up here, but each one of these small numbers there is a date every 10 years of the census, and you can see that from the 1790s we've moved from around the Virginia, Maryland area. Now the mean center of population in the United States is approximately the center of Missouri. What are the other trends that we're hearing about from census data? That rural counties are beginning to die. What does that mean? It means that the birth rates are falling beneath the death rates. And there's a question. Is it happening all over the place? Is it in select counties? How do we start interpreting the data from the last census of 2010? And there's an ongoing debate in that regard, but it's still something to be aware of, because now we're beginning to question, again, why are we looking at programs to bring money into rural areas? Are we still in the storehouse era because the frontier era has long passed? Is rural America still providing goods and services to the rest of the nation? And arguably, yes. There are empty spots in parts of the country, but this is not the sum of rural America. If we're harvesting resources that used to be used for food, you remember America used to be the breadbasket of the world. So granted, there are now other nations that have adopted and implemented very successfully very efficient farming techniques where you're able to get more produce out of an acre of land. But we're finding ways to use our produce for new and innovative technological actions. Other resources are being discovered as well. I hope this is clear on the map, but the Bakken Shale that covers North Dakota and Montana is estimated to have about 200 billion barrels of oil beneath it. Now, that second picture beneath it, I joked with someone who had clued me into this and had a conversation about what's going on in North Dakota. I said, so you're talking about some sort of like a man cave in North Dakota where all these oil workers are going? He said, well, that's actually what they're calling it in the State House and every place else across the state. They're called man camps. And you might have cities in North Dakota, a rural town of maybe 2,500 people here and maybe 2,500 people here, and you've got a man camp holding 3,000 men. Some of them are single, others are married, and they go there for the week and then travel home on the weekends. But these fellows are demanding the same broadband services that they're accustomed to at home. So broadband it's the new electricity. It's the new telephone. And it's not just for their entertainment. It's not just for email. But the businesses that are exploiting the oil resources are relying on these technologies as well. So we've talked about qualitative factors in the relationship between rural America and urban America. Can we quantify them? What sort of economic data makes us comfortable with the sorts of efforts that are being used to make sure that broadband networks are deployed throughout the United States? Or better yet, can we quantify the economic impact of just rural telecommunications? I mean, we know what oil looks like. We know what ethanol looks like. What about the money poured into the networks? I'm not an economist. Fortunately, I worked with one. By doing some modeling, by doing some multipliers. And the notion of the multiplier is that you employ somebody, and your employee not only earns a wage from you, but is then able to go to the grocery store and purchase groceries. She might own a house in town and pay property taxes, take her car to the local mechanic. So there's all these sorts of multipliers, and we know that a company located in a town creates an economic multiplier for that town. The question is, does that create a ripple effect, an outward multiplier? And a recent study that was released, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, found that of a $14.5 billion rural industry, I've got to look at my paper here because I can't see on the screen, 66% of that impact hit urban America. And the reason it hit urban America is because of the inputs for rural telecom. Those don't come from the rural area. Infrastructure, plant supplies, fleet vehicles, hardware, software, that is usually produced outside. Now there's a different multiplier for each state because a company providing telecom service in California will probably have easier access to a software company that's based in Silicon Valley, so that money tends to stay in the state. But if you're putting in a network in the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota, you're going to be reaching out of state. So, at the end of the day, the impact of a rural telecom economy flows mostly to urban America. So there is that benefit. Dollars, cents, what about jobs? Jobs, the split changes a little bit. In this instance, 54% of the jobs stay in the rural areas, but we understand that because your line man lives in the rural area. Your customer service representative lives in that rural area. But there's urban jobs created by this as well. Again, whether it is the producer of the fleet vehicle, whether there is an engineering firm that's located in a metropolitan area, whether you have counsel or a consultant located in an urban area that then branches out and serves many rural areas. So there is always a positive economic benefit when that money is put toward building out a broadband network in rural America. So now we've talked about the societal, the social contracts, qualitative factors, and we've quantified them as well. So what does this mean? We're at the edge of a transition. When I was first signed up to speak to you today, it was back at a time when the FCC was promising that they were going to release new universal service fund reform rules in August. That's what they had promised. They released this notice of proposed rulemaking in February, and they said by August we're going to adopt a new regulatory regime. August slipped to September, and I thought to myself, all right, I've still got some time. And then September slipped to October, and the FCC scheduled a meeting for October 21st. And I thought to myself, I'm going to have to somehow digest anywhere from 400 to 500 pages and deliver that to you 4 days later. Fortunately, the FCC pushed it off again. Kind of tough to read on the screen, but the Connect America Fund is scheduled to be addressed by the FCC at 10:30 a.m. Thursday morning. So when we talk about being on the edge of a transition, it's not quite the hyperbole that we often have at these sorts of events. I mean, we are really waiting. And as much as we have a sense of what might be there and what the FCC might do and what they might not do, there are still a lot of moving pieces because everyone from the industry keeps coming back to the FCC and saying, well, change this and change that. And if you do this, it's going to have a negative or positive impact this way. And again, quantile regression analyses, federal agency rulemaking, the reason why you see the sun peeking up between the clouds there at the top of the FCC stationary is because 1 week before the FCC has a meeting, it has what it calls the sunshine period. And that's when you can't communicate with the FCC anymore. They can call you, but you can't call them to advocate. So right now we're in that sunshine period. We're on the edge. All this time, we've had the national economic studies. I know that folks from Missouri, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma have filed their own economic studies with the FCC, and they've told the same story roughly. So 42 hours to go. We know that there's a lot of uncertainty. We know that there could be adverse impacts. We don't know what the extent of them are yet. So when we're talking about being at the edge, there's a technological aspect, we've got the cultural preferences, and we have the uncertainty that comes of not knowing what's going to be on the other side of that sidewalk after Thursday morning. But what we do know is that whatever decisions are made that affect rural broadband providers, those effects will have a spin-off impact to affect the entire nation as well. Thank you very much for your time today. This is my... Thank you. This is my contact information. Please feel free anytime. Call me, email me, any questions. I'm always glad to talk and always glad to answer. Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Josh.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you.